Good evening, everyone. My name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, which is a ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. So on behalf of all the Sisters of St. Joseph, I welcome all of you tonight, whether you are joining from near or far, old friends of the Sisters of St. Joseph or new ones joining us for the first time tonight. Welcome. Everyone is welcome as we begin the third season of Spirit Alive programming, which includes this wonderful 6-week course in women and their roles in earliest Christianity. Before I introduce our presenter, I have a couple of announcements. The first is, I apologize if your link said panelist. A lot of panicked people called today or wrote in. That was a mistake. I know that you like to just sit back and listen, so that's all you have to do is sit back and listen. And as you come in, Matthew has muted you. So when it's time for questions, you'll have to unmute yourself. I want to remind you that each class is being recorded. If you can't make it tonight, and I understand that there are 145 people registered in this course. We have people from Canada, from Europe, from India, and from Australia who may not be able to be with us at this particular hour, East Coast time. So those recordings will be available to you. Usually it takes 48 to 72 hours, and you'll get a link if you're registered, which tells you that the recording is ready, and you can go to that, or you can just go to the Spirit Alive homepage and you will see a link to recordings. So you'll be able to do that, and those recordings will be posted on the Spirit Alive YouTube channel. If you have audio trouble, you can look on your screen and pick the CC letters that are there. For iPads, they're usually at the top of your screen. For computers, they're usually at the lower right-hand side. And if you choose CC, of course, you're going to be able to read what is being said. Professor Osiek will leave time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as she can. Since there are so many of you enrolled in this course, discussion is going to be a little bit more limited. So if you have questions that you would like answered, please write them in the Q&A box. So look along the bottom of your screen. You usually see participants, Q&A, polls, and so on. Please use the question and answer box, and Carolyn can look at those, and she will answer as many questions as possible. If you use the raised hand feature, that's also a possibility, but remember, she might not see your tile on her screen. Finally, if you like our programming, I always ask that you show your appreciation by making a donation online at Spirit Alive, because it's your support, along with the support of the Sisters of St. Joseph, that makes all of these programs possible and free. I'd like to introduce Carolyn Osiek, a sister of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Carolyn has a PhD in New Testament and Christian origins from Harvard University. She was professor of New Testament at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago for 26 years before joining the faculty of Brite Divinity School at Texas Christian University. She retired in 2009, and as many religious do, they retire to another job. And so she became the provincial archivist of the Society of Sacred Heart for the United States and Canadian province. During her very distinguished career, Carolyn was president of the Catholic Biblical Association of America and the Society of Biblical Literature. She is the author or editor of over a dozen books and numerous scholarly and popular articles on all topics related to the New Testament, the early church, and of course her own religious congregation. So please join me in welcoming Carolyn Osiek. So it's all yours, Carolyn, and we feel very blessed to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and good evening or good morning or whatever it is for where you are, because I understand that there are people from a lot of different parts of the world here. Maria asked me some time ago to do this, and I thought, oh, great, you know, be a little group of people and we'll just sort of talk. Well, apparently 146 people signed up for this. I think not all of them are here tonight, this morning, whatever, but a lot of you are, and I'm very happy to see you. So I'm going to share my screen. So this is the title that I suggested. I was just reading again this morning. I think it was a reading in the liturgy from Ephesians, and it said that that God established in the church apostles and prophets and teachers and evangelists and all kinds of other people. And Paul at one point says very clearly, God established in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and then all kinds of other gifts. And I think that we don't always envision that or imagine that in both genders, in complementary. And so I thought that this would be a good way to come at it. And at the same time, I began to think about how to space this out with 6 classes. And so this is my draft of how to do that. That tonight we would do context, early Christian women in context, something about the social invisibility of women. There will be a lot of detail here about context, about people's lives and the social structures. The reward at the end, if you stick with it, is that we will look at the household codes, the famous lines, wives, be submissive to your husbands, etc. And there's a lot to be said about those texts. So that would be tonight. And then the next week, the women of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Anna, Mary, Elizabeth, Martha, and Mary, the Syrophoenician woman, and the woman in Luke 11 who says, blessed are the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you. And of course, the women at the tomb. So women in the synoptic gospels, basically. And then the next time, John's gospel, because there's an awful lot to be said there too. The Samaritan woman, Martha, and Mary as they appear in John rather than in Luke, the unnamed mother of Jesus, and the shadow background figure of Sophia, of wisdom. You notice Mary Magdalene is not on that list, and that's because I think she deserves a whole evening for herself. And so on the 4th week, we will do Mary Magdalene in text and tradition. And then the 5th week, the women of the Pauline churches. And there are a lot to cover there. And yeah, there's a whole lot to do there. But then the last one, I thought beyond the New Testament, getting into the question of deacons, the role of deacons, widows, from house church to assembly, and then something on catacomb art and catacomb representation. And there's a lot to say there about women. So that's a kind of an outline as I see it. Whether this could evolve in a different direction, certainly, but that's kind of where, for now, where I see where we're going. So tonight, New Testament women in context. The lovely woman that you see there is a woman of the New Testament period. This one is actually early 2nd century. She is a mummy portrait. If you want to know what people looked like in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Jesus and the time of the New Testament, just Google sometime mummy portraits, and you will see lots of them. There are hundreds of them that have survived. These are actual portraits of people. And apparently, instead of, these are people who could afford to be mummified when they died. And instead of that enigmatic sort of wooden face, they cut a hole in the mummy coffin and they put the actual portrait of the person in there. Usually the person in the portrait is much younger than the actual person in the coffin, which means that they had that portrait done earlier. And perhaps it was portrayed in their home. It's like your photograph, in your home. And then when you die, you put that in. So anyway, there are lots of them that are preserved, and they really show us something of what people looked like. As I said, in the Eastern Mediterranean, most of these people are Greek in background. And if you examine the portraits of people on Greek pottery, on Greek vases, ancient Greek vases, you'll see something very similar. So there's reason to believe that people in Judea and Syria and places like that looked very similar to that. I believe she's actually in the Walters Gallery in Baltimore. So the Roman world, we're dealing with the Roman world here, whether they were people living in Roman cities or in villages in Galilee or whatever. The world that they lived in is Roman. And if you've ever seen a map of the Roman world in the 1st or 2nd century, the entire Mediterranean, the north, east, west, south, everything was controlled by the Roman Empire. And so the overall presence of Rome was there. Not so invasive as is sometimes imagined, the Quo Vadis kind of Roman soldiers marching through Nazareth. No, that's imagination. What the Romans did was to rule by local aristocracy. And so in the case of Judea and Samaria and Galilee, it was the Herodian dynasty. So local rulers, but always Rome is the shadow behind it all. And something to realize is that it was not a capitalist society and it was not a democracy. Those of us who have grown up in democratic capitalist societies, I think, take this for granted. And you can't when you're trying to understand this system. It is not an economic system in which the market controls prices. It's not a system in which there is a strong middle class. There is basically no middle class. And certainly it is not a democracy. There was the experiment with democracy, of course, in the Greek city-states, but by this time they're not. There are local leadership groups, and many of the local city and village leaders are elected by a select group of people who qualify as citizens. So there is some democratic movement there. Women were not citizens in certainly in Greek societies. They were in Roman society, but they did not have the vote. So women are not participants in any kind of government process, except through political power, which we'll talk about later. Social power, more of birth than of wealth. More of birth, than of wealth. Money talks in a capitalist society, and that's how you build elitism, is the people who have the money to have the power. Having money helps anywhere, for sure, and it helped here, but it's the question of your social standing, the social standing of your family, of your tribe, of your village, whatever, is the thing that really speaks, and that people expect certain kinds of behavior based on your social status. So people who are elites and the people who are politically powerful are expected to also be virtuous. And of course, that doesn't always happen. And so they are much under suspicion, usually, of not being honest. Patronage is a very important piece in this. It's not what you know, it's who you know. It's the connections that people can have. It's very explicit in Roman society, less explicit in other aspects of this Mediterranean life at the time. But people who have some kind of power to get things done form coteries of clients, and who latch on to you and expect things from you. And in return, the patron is to be generous and to give, to do what he or she can. And women can certainly be patrons as well, because status trumps gender. And that's an important thing to realize, that social status is the thing that gives you access to power. Women less so than men usually, but women certainly also exercise patronage at all levels. And that's an important piece of women's social power in this society. Come on. It's gotten stuck. Hold on. Yeah, there we moved. Yes. Okay. So the difference of urban and rural. In many societies, the state of Missouri, where I live in the United States, is an example of that. There are some real differences between urban life and out in the countryside. You know, the cities contain more people with a college education, with some white-collar jobs, therefore more liberal thinking, that kind of thing. And the people who live very differently in rural situations tend to think differently than that, and to live differently. And that was certainly true in the Roman world as well. Now, a place like Nazareth, we have a hard time trying to sort of get a sense of what life was like there, because we know so little about it. But certainly it was on the Roman map. There were some good roads that led into it. There is archaeological evidence of trade that went on there. Capernaum, even more so. Capernaum was on a major trade route. And when it says that Jesus moved, and Matthew says it explicitly at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. It's to be more where the action is. So it is not to be thought that these are little villages that are cut off from the outside world. No, but probably that difference of thinking from them to people in Jerusalem or Ephesus or Rome or someplace like that would certainly be there. Elites and non-elites. Yeah, pretty much what I was saying before about status is the important thing there. And I said basically there's no middle class. There are people who are middle income, more or less secure, but they're not a middle class as they are in capitalist societies that have real social power. You know, most of the land is held by large landowners. The gospel that's coming up on Sunday, if you're following the Catholic lectionary, the laborers in the vineyard, you've got a man there who has a very large vineyard, because he's sending these day laborers out all day to keep working, and they're not finished, you know, until the end of the day. So you've got an example there of one of these rich landowners. And therefore, you have a situation of either tenants, like the gospel last week with the unmerciful servant who had this great debt, and he was about to be sold into debt slavery. Again, a rich landowner and someone here who has very limited resources. Okay. So you have that pattern, and also, particularly in Italy, we know about it in Italy more than any other place, large, again, very large farms worked by enslaved people. So in some cases it's enslavement, in other cases it's tenant farmers. Slavery is a part of the society that is simply taken for granted. Almost nobody questions slavery. There's a 2nd century philosopher, Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, who was born in slavery. and then became a freedman and a well-known philosopher. And even he takes this Stoic position that your legal status doesn't really matter. What really matters is you don't want to be a slave to your passions. That's a typical Stoic approach, but even somebody who had experienced slavery is thinking like that. So it's just it's part of society. It is not questioned by New Testament writers. They certainly are for good relationships, slaveholders treating their slaves fairly, justly. But Paul even says in 1 Corinthians 9, well, what difference does it make whether you're a slave or free? If you're a slave, you're Christ's freedman, and if you're free, you're Christ's slave. It's that same kind of just sort of going over, taking the institution for granted. And there are all kinds of levels of slavery in this world, of course. The enslavement that we encounter in the New Testament is domestic. It's household slaves. And it seems that in at least in more Romanized situations, that somewhere in the mid-30s, that when an enslaved person is about mid-30s, there's a high likelihood, a high possibility of freedom, and in various ways, and I don't want to go into all those details. In some cases, simply the will of the slaveholder, will, that is intention, or will, bequest, of the slaveholder, sometimes by amassing enough money on the side so that you can buy your freedom. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to do that. Freedmen and freedwomen were probably the most socially mobile people in this world. They were people who now could have legitimate families. They could have their own property. They could therefore make a will for their descendants. They could create a real family. And they also were sort of the backbone of some of the businesses and small businesses, you know. There's thinking that Lydia in Acts 16 could well be a freedwoman. She seems to run a dye business out of her house, out of her home. There's very good evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum of women who were running businesses. So this whole thing about freedmen and freedwomen, and then freeing manumission of female slaves for marriage is also very common. So you suspect that there were affectionate relationships between male slaveholders and their female slaves sometimes. And when they want a real marriage, they will emancipate them. Manumit is the right word, to manumit the female slave. Language and trade. Yeah, language. The international, you may be aware that today the international language is English almost everywhere. You know, anywhere you go in an airport, the language is going to be the local language, and it's going to be English. The international language was Greek, not Latin. Latin was spoken in the western part of the empire, Italy, Spain, North Africa, not very much in the east. And even in the first century, the underclasses of Rome were largely Greek speaking, and that was just turning over to Latin. At the time of Tertullian in North Africa, late 2nd into 3rd century, they were just changing from Greek to Latin. So Greek is really the language, and we ask sometimes about the Gospels. Did Jesus speak Greek? Did he know any Greek? And I think Jesus must have known street Greek. enough to talk to merchants and traders and the kids and people that you would deal with on the street, as well as Hebrew, and his first language would be Aramaic. So when you picture, for example, his conversation with a centurion or with Pilate or with any Roman, it's not going to be in Latin, it's going to be in Greek. And yeah, that movie, the latest movie that was put out on Jesus, it had on the Passion, had Jesus and Pilate talking in Latin. No way. No, it would have been Greek, and Pilate would have to speak Greek to deal with people in that part of the world. So, but there are all kinds of other languages, and they sort of get submerged in our assumption that it's Latin and Greek, and then of course we have the Jews speaking Aramaic. But there are all kinds of other languages. There was native Egyptian. There was a language evolving that was a combination of Egyptian and Greek. There were native languages in Asia Minor, which is Turkey today. And then, of course, up north, the so-called barbarians had their own languages. And something that intrigues me is there's a line in Acts of the Apostles. They're in Derbe, I think, in the middle of Asia Minor. And it says the people came out and spoke to them in Lycaonian. Lycaonia was the old name of a district there, And Luke, of course, is trying to show off. But it had to have been feasible. It had to have been understandable that they were aware that there were these other languages that eventually died out, but they were there. And that brings up really something that is also, I think, really important, and that's to realize the tremendous diversity that there was in this society. We have immigrants moving around, some because of economic advantage and some because of the upsets of war. There are people on the move all the time. In the middle of the 2nd century in Gaul, in France, there is a pogrom. There's a brief persecution of Christians, and they're all Greek-speaking immigrants from Asia Minor. So you suspect they're one of these situations in which people are against immigrants. There was constant immigration to Rome, and we suspect that by the middle of the 1st century, there's something like 50,000 Jews in Rome. So a lot of moving around, and that's something also to realize. And there are names of people mentioned in the New Testament, in the Pauline churches, that that came from someplace else, and Acts of the Apostles too. And trade is an important part of that, and the Silk Route, the famous Silk Route all the way to India was well established by this time. Trade is a very significant part of the world and of the economy. Legal systems. There is, of course, Roman law, which we know the most about, and on the whole, Roman law governed things, but it didn't govern personal law, family law for people who were not Romans. In family law, it applied only to Roman citizens. So we have a vast number of people, the majority of people who were at that point not Roman citizens, who are living by other laws. As I said, the overall thing when they had to deal with magistrates and things, they would have to deal with Roman law, but not in their own lives. And it's very interesting that when scholars try to write about what life was like, let's say in Galilee for Jews, we go back to Deuteronomy, which was the latest wording, the latest codification Jewish law, but we don't have a clue whether people in the villages there were paying any attention to Deuteronomy, to what Deuteronomy said. I mean, we just really don't know. And as I said, the law we know most about is Roman, and that's what we kind of slip into. That's what scholars slip into because we know so much about it, and we know very little about what's actually going on in other legal systems. There are Greek legal systems that are specific to Greek communities, Greek cities. But again, we don't know much about family law. That really governs civic law. Judaism, Hellenism, and Romanitas. Yeah. Hellenism means the influence of Greek culture, which was pervasive. And we can thank Alexander the Great for that, in the 300s BC, for his getting together a Greek army to go fight against the Persians to the east, present-day Iran, and because they were menacing the West constantly. And so he pushed his armies that way, and in their wake left Greek culture everywhere. The whole eastern coast of the Mediterranean, Egypt particularly, and that's why you had this great extent of Greek culture with local variations, but basically Greek speaking for an international language all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And in that context, and then the overlay of Romanitas, of Roman power and Roman culture that I've been talking about, we have our Jews. And Jews, Israelites, Judeans, the titles are bandied about today. We're uncertain about exactly what to say, how to call them. Jew simply means, in Greek, it's Judaios, which is the same as Judean. It simply means somebody from Judea. But we're all Jews from Judea? Heavens no, because of the diaspora that had been happening for centuries. There were Jewish communities from the 5th century BC around Aswan in Upper Egypt. As I said, Rome, they're all over the place. So they weren't really Judeans anymore. And to try to understand what was their identity is something that's very complex. And of course, Galileans are slightly different from Judeans because they live in a different place with developing their own cultural customs, etc. Remember, at one point in the Passion narrative in Matthew, Matthew has denied that Judas has denied that he knows Jesus, and the slave girl, says, "Oh no, you're Galilean. Your speech gives you away." They had their own accent. What is Judaism? To try to describe it or define it is very, very difficult. And in that context, we have Jesus and his disciples, the Galileans. Jesus, who goes to Judea and never gets away from the Eastern Mediterranean, up north to what is now Lebanon, but that's about it. Paul, who travels all over the place, even according to tradition, to Spain. So, and Paul he calls himself an Israelite. He does not call himself a Judaios, a Jew. So it's very complex, and women are part of that whole world. So gender concepts. It has to do somewhat with honor and shame, which is a big category that's been played with a lot in recent years, in recent scholarship. And it can be said that as far as the culture is traditional that women embody the shame of the family. And what that means is not that they're shameful, but what it means is that they carry the honor of the family. Women's bodily integrity, women's moral integrity is an important part of the honor of the family. Men are seen to be superior, of course, to women. That was taken for granted. And yet, as I said, social status is something that overrides that. But women, I call them socially invisible. There's so many situations in which we know women are there and they're not recognized. And and we're going to talk about that more next week. But a really good example is that 5 times in Acts of the Apostles, either Peter or Paul stands up, starts a speech in public, and starts it with Andres Adelphoi. And Andres is male people. It's not a generic term. Adelphoi can be brothers. Its brothers can be brothers and sisters. But men, he's addressing himself to men. And you know that women are present in these situations, you know. The picture that you see here is of a man and a woman who are married. They are people who were born into slavery, and they both became freed from the same household from a man named Publius Aetius. And they are now freed, and they have married. And it's called the dextrarum iunctio, the joining of the right hands. You see her right hand is coming into his. And it was an expression of marriage. It also apparently is sometimes an expression of partnership, but here it is clearly marriage. And she looks younger than he, certainly. We know that they were freed people because of the PL here on both of their names. It means Publii Liberta and Publii Libertus. Freedman, freedwoman of somebody named Publius Aetius. But it's a beautiful representation of marriage, and marriage was truly could be a joining of people in affection, but it wasn't necessarily that. The working definition of marriage here would be the joining of representatives of 2 families in
Wow.
order to,
what the heck?
In order to ensure the carrying on of the family and the legitimate transfer of property. The higher the social status, the more that is true. But it is always a joining of families. And therefore the man and the woman, consent is required, but it doesn't mean that they choose each other necessarily. And I'll tell you something, just a little side here. I have some friends in Bethlehem who are Christians, and their family's been Christian since the 14th century. They're Catholics. And one of the young men was of marriageable age, and so I said to his aunt, now how does that happen? She said, well, the aunts and the uncles get together, and we sort of look around, and we see who might be good, who might be a good bride for him, and we sort of push him in that direction. You know, we make inquiries. At the same time, his sisters would then sort of seek out friends who knew those girls and what are they really like, and it's a whole network, it's a whole pattern. And he did indeed marry one of the girls from the town that the family was happy with. So it still goes on in many societies, and it's not an arranged marriage, but it is a family process that puts 2 people together. Family. There's a Roman lawyer, a legal scholar, who remarks, we have no word for father, mother, and children. Now, when we think family, that's about the first thing we think of, the nuclear family. No, family, whether in Latin or Greek, domus familia in Latin, oikos, oikeia in Greek, means a whole layer of things. It can mean the vertical family line. It can mean the extended family with the aunts and uncles. It can mean everybody who's living under the same roof, which includes the slaves. So it's much broader and inclusive term. And really the nuclear family it's recognized as the basis, the father, mother, and children. That's the basis of the household code formulation. You can go to Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, and he talks about that. He talks about the relationships of father, mother, and children. So they're aware of that, but the terminology is different. It's much broader. Now we have the hierarchical model of the household, assuming that the man is the head of the household. What we're going to see later on is that we have some good evidence for women also being heads of households. They don't talk about, the theorists don't talk about it, but it does happen. It did happen. But the man is the husband to the wife, he's the father to the children, and he's the slaveholder to the slaves. And Aristotle talks about how the husband, father, slaveholder should relate to the three categories: wife, children, and slaves. So it's all about him. It's how he governs the family. And he should have a different relationship, certainly with his wife. It's a loving relationship. With the children, he's a benevolent monarch, and he's a dictator to the slaves. So this man, who is the center of everything, should have these different relationships. And that's the way Aristotle takes it. There are a number of other what we call treatises on household management, and they do pretty much the same thing. It's how should this man relate to, and one of them is about a new wife who has been brought into the household, and typically the husband's going to be older than the wife, the woman, and how he should teach her everything. Well, she probably already has learned that from her family, before she came into the marriage, and she's supposed to be the sort of the queen of the household, the manager of the household. And one of the things I just enjoy imagining is this young woman moving into a household that is already established, if it is, with older, very experienced enslaved people. And she's supposed to be the one who manages them, who governs them. And I think that must have been really something to try to imagine. So that's kind of the rundown on context. And we're stuck again. Come on. Yeah. So let's move into the so-called household codes. There are two of them, Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5. And they really take off from these treatises on household management. Now, what I want to point out is how different they are from what I just described. They're different, first of all, in that the subordinate person is referenced first and is addressed, which is not typical in the treatises of household management. As I said, it's all to him, how he should treat those people in the third person. But the household codes address the subordinate first in every case. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Now, when we look at that, we think, they would have said, yes, of course. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. Didn't always happen that way. We have plenty of stories from Roman elites of when it didn't happen that way. But that's the theory. the word, the subordination hypotazo, is a different word than the man's relationship to the children and the slaves, which is obedience, obey. It's a different word. It's simply submit is, I guess, the best word for it. But as is proper in the Lord, so already it's put into a religious context, which the others are not. So husbands, love your wives, avoid bitterness, okay? Treat them well. Children, obey your parents. This is pleasing to the Lord. Again, reference to the religious context. And one need not assume that this is only junior children. Adult children as well had, in some case, in the Roman case, a legal obligation to obey their father as long as he was alive. The father dies and they are emancipated, which means they are freed from that responsibility to obedience. So fathers, don't provoke your children. Slaves, obey your human masters in everything, not only when you're being watched so that you'll curry favor, but in simplicity of heart, fearing the Lord. So again, the responsibility of your state in life in the context of the Lord. So whatever you do it from the heart. So the Colossian one expands a little on the situation of the enslaved. This is really meant for slaves. You see, it says, "Be slaves of the Lord Christ." Do it genuinely, knowing that you will receive your payment, your due payment. Be slaves of the Lord Christ. So you're not slaves only to a human master, but to Christ. Again, hard for us to understand, but if you put it in the context of the situation that they're in, it in fact introduces kind of a I want to say a transparency between the human action and the serving of God. The wrongdoer will be punished. Okay, there is no partiality. Yeah, the word there is prosopolemsia, which is looking at the face, regarding the face, so treating one person differently from another, and that comes up a number of times. That before God, everyone is equal. Equality is not a social category that they use very much. They didn't think people were equal. But in God, there is no male and female, slave or free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. So before God, the judgment is the same for everyone. And masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, because you have a master in heaven as well. Now, as hard as this language is for us, I want to suggest that in context, this is progressive. This is taking what the given of family relationships as they are theorized, and it's putting them in the context of service to God, of our life in God, and I think it is something fairly new, really. So let's take on Ephesians, and here the development is not about slaves; it's about wives. So the first verse, before you get into it, and in both of these cases, it's also important to look at context, the context in the chapter. In both cases, it's about mutual relations. It's about how we get along with each other in mutual love. And then it slips into the household code. So in verse 21, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. So it doesn't say who one another, doesn't say who that is. So we should all be subordinate to each other. And then from there it moves into, again, wives, and then husbands, and then it'll go on with children, parents, etc. So wives, be subordinate, same word, as to the Lord. And now here's a little development. For the husband is head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church and the savior of the body. So we have now moved into ecclesiology. And the author aligns husband with Christ, wife with church, which in later Christian development is going to be rather dangerous, because it sets up the husband as a figure of Christ and the wife is not the figure of Christ. And so, the whole imaging of Christ. But here, that's not intended. What is intended is to say the relationship of husband and wife mirrors the relationship of Christ in the church. And this is new thinking here. Then it goes back to the subordination theme. Just as the church is subordinate to Christ, wives should be subordinate. Okay. So husbands, then, love your wives as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her. That's a high bar. To sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water. We think that that's an allusion to baptism, that he might present himself to, so we're moving here into the relationship of Christ in the church, without spot or wrinkle, that the church might be holy and without blemish. So husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. The one who loves his wife loves himself. People have remarked that what's expected of husbands is far more than what is expected of wives. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So the whole gloss, the whole development of the whole commentary here, it is a rather powerful one about the relationship of Christ in the church being expressed in marriage. And we get hung up, understandably, on the subordination thing. And I think sometimes miss the power of the imagery, particularly in this situation where the social relationship is taken for granted. And in fact, the social relationship here is sanctified. The family relationship that is expected, that's given in the society, is made holy. It is it's elevated to mirror Christ in the church. Then he quotes Genesis. The man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh, which is such an interesting statement, because it says the man leaves his father and mother. And as far as we know, most of these societies are patriarchal, not matriarchal. So it's the woman who leaves her family and goes to the wife, but to the man. But that's not the way it's said in Genesis. But this is a great mystery, and I'm talking about Christ in the church, you see. So the author has kind of gotten off the track of talking about marriage and getting really excited about the relationship of Christ in the church, and then comes back. In every case, every one of you love his wife as himself, and the wife should respect her husband. A different word there, not the subordination word, but reverence, really, respect. Then children, obey your parents. In the Lord is, it's uncertain in the manuscript whether that was there originally. It could have been a copyist who sort of think, oh, that's what it's supposed to say, and puts it in. Obey your parents, for this is the right thing. Honor your father and mother. So again, we have a biblical quotation here. It's the first commandment with a promise, which is interesting, so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life on the earth. So honoring your father and your mother is going to make it go well for you. You're going to be rewarded for that. And that, of course, again, is not just for underage children. It's intended for adults. And then fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in instruction. And slaves, be obedient to your human masters with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart, as to Christ. Again, when you obey your masters as you're supposed to, and it's always there are women who are also slaveholders, but the typology is always masculine. You're actually serving Christ, and very similar there to the Colossians one, not just when you're being watched, but do the will of God, because that's when you're serving the Lord, and know that each one will be requited for whatever good he does, slave or free. Again, sounds like Epictetus there. Whether you're slave or free, what really matters is that you live fully and conquer your passions and do what is right. Masters, act in the same way. Don't bully. You have a master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality. Again, there's that statement that you are, the social inequality is taken for granted. It is not questioned, but the relationships within those social structures are given very high ideals. So, yeah. Now, if you're interested in some reading that might be relevant to these general kinds of contexts that I'm talking about, here are a couple of things. Susan Hyland has 2 books. A Women in the New Testament World, and then Finding Phoebe, What New Testament Women Were Really Like. These are quite readable books that you might enjoy if you want to pursue more what I've been talking about this evening. And then if you have the Jerome Commentary for the 21st Century, this is the successor of the Jerome Biblical Commentary, the 2 other editions that came out. And it has a new article by yours truly called Early Christianity in Context, which goes beyond what I've been talking about now. And then Barbara Reed's Wisdom's Feast, an invitation to feminist interpretation of the scriptures, kind of sets the pace, the context for feminist interpretation. And again, very, very readable, very good thing to read. So that is what I have to share this evening. And maybe we can see what you have to say. So if you want to think a bit, if you want to, whatever you want to say or questions that you would like to ask, the floor is open.
Carolyn, well, I'm here. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things you made very clear tonight was that the social structures remained intact, but they became inflected in a new way. I think that sometimes what people have in mind when they want change is they want the social structure to disappear or completely be eradicated. I mean, how do you see that kind of nuancing of structure maybe working in the church today? I mean, is it too much for women to hope for that the social structures and hierarchies that we have in the church are going to just be completely eradicated because people look to no male, no female, no Jew, no Greek, meaning nothing that exists should be the way it is? And yet what you're teaching us is that in the New Testament, the structures were taken for granted, but they were kind of turned around on themselves. I mean, is that what we're looking for today? Is that what we should be looking for today? Is that typical of how the church operates? We leave the social structures intact, but we kind of move them. just your comments.
Yeah. Well, two important things have happened between that time and now. One is our understanding of social structures and how to change social structures. There's no theory of that in the ancient Mediterranean in societies. There's no theory of how structures change and how empowering people is better than giving to people. That's another piece. I mean, it's always give, but that whole, the Freire thing about not giving somebody a fish, but teaching them to fish, that enabling, that is just, they just do not seem to be aware of that. The other development is what I would call personalism. And that's beginning with something like the household codes, the treating of people as if they had rights per se, as if there was human dignity. That is not something that was taken for granted then either. So we live in a very different kind of a world, I think, in which we have seen social structures change and change radically. And we don't have it down pat how to do that, but we know that it's possible, and I think that just gives a whole different perspective to things. Does that sort of speak to what you were asking? There's a Q&A here question. How is the meaning of the church so profound at such an age in the church? Yeah, that's a good question too. It's one of the to me good pieces of evidence that Ephesians and Colossians come from a slightly later time than Paul himself. Biblical scholarship today, I think most New Testament scholars don't think that Paul wrote Colossians or Ephesians. Ephesians looks back to the age of the apostles, so it's probably from a later, the next generation, but still the amount of the creation of an image of a transcendent church. In Paul's other letters, the church is either an individual group of people or clusters of people within a given city. The church in Corinth, the church in Philippi, whatever. In Ephesians, the church is a transcendent idea, a transcendent image that's heavenly, that exists in heaven and is expressed on earth. And it's you're right that a significant step has been taken there in understanding of the reality of the church. Yeah. Anything else anybody wants to say?
I think you have a couple more questions in the Q&A.
A Q&A? Oh yeah, two more have come up. Wondering your take on 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus appears where Paul distinguishes between the 12, the 500, and all the apostles. Oh yeah. Yeah. Where and those 500, what about those 500? It's a great passage there where Paul says he says in Galatians that he spent 2 weeks with Peter and James. So that's presumably where he got this. And there is already and this is probably in the 50s. There's already a kind of a creedal statement there. He appeared to, and there's the 12. There's Peter. 500. You just never hear anything else about these 500. And then all the apostles. So who are the apostles? Probably not the 12. Probably a larger identifiable group of people who are missionaries who are devoted more or less full time to the gospel. It would be people like Andronicus and Junia, who are mentioned in Romans 16. Who knows who else? But your question is right on, that it doesn't make sense. The only way that it would make sense is that Paul is combining. The only way it would make sense, the apostles or the 12, is that Paul is combining two different recitations of appearances. And in the first one, he appears to Peter, and the second one, he appears to James and all the apostles, and it would be the 12. It's a real conundrum. But certainly there's plenty of evidence in Paul's letters that there are other people who are called apostles. There's a bunch of them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Epaphroditus in Philippians is called an apostle. The translations sometimes smooth that over by referring to them as messengers. Well, a messenger is an apostle. It's somebody who is sent, and the word in Greek is apostle. And I think sometimes translators get antsy about that because it's supposed to be only the 12 who are apostles. That's Luke. Luke's understanding is that you've got the 12, and they're so important that they're 12, that when Judas falls out, they got to elect somebody to replace him, But elsewhere, the list of the 12 gets very hazy at the end. Of course, it's the 12 tribes, the replacement of the 12 tribes. So that's why the number is significant. But so I hope that has answered a bit. How would you suggest to help people understand the reality of the mystery of Christ in the church? Yeah. I think that we don't really appreciate the presence of Christ in the way that our theological tradition has given it to us. What Ephesians does is to suggest that one relationship there, well, actually the three relationships, I guess, but the author focuses on the marriage relationship. That is one of the expressions of the church. Well, what are the other relationships that express the presence of Christ and the reality of Christ? Theologically, it's the faithful assembled to worship, whether it's Eucharist or any other kind of prayer. Do we really realize that where 2 or 3 of you are, there I am in the midst of you? I think maybe some greater awareness of that might help us. How would you suggest to help people understand? Oh, I'm sorry, that's the one. They're 2 of the same thing there. Yeah. And then Rita, in A Woman's Place, you comment that social invisibility of women in public life in Greco-Roman antiquity is striking compared to many other cultures. Does that imply Roman culture was more misogynistic than Mesopotamian, for example? Probably, yeah. There is it's the heightened importance of the male in Roman culture, particularly, that I think does that. And we're gonna talk more about that next week. Okay. The apostles are not the 12 women apostles. Yes. Well, we know of one, at least, Junia, and probably Prisca and Aquila were, they're not called apostles in the text, but they probably were part of the group that would be considered the apostles. Yes, there were women apostles as well, and we'll talk about that. Thoughts on Julian of Norwich, 12th century mystic, referring to Jesus as mother. Yeah, she's not original in that. That's Clement of Alexandria says that. Through the centuries, there are people who use that image And Julian is famous for it with us because Julian has become very popular. It's simply the recognition of the loving care of Jesus, that, and we're going to talk about this when we get to Gospel of John too, the kind of gender bending that you have, particularly in John, because the role, the job description of wisdom, Sophia, is the job description of Jesus in the prologue. So we will talk more about that.
Carolyn, I think we have time for if there's another question. If not, we're moving on to 8:13, 8:14. Do you have any more questions in there in the Q&A?
Oh, there maybe is one more.
I put one in.
Oh, two. Yeah, two.
Yep.
Phoebe then had status because she was upper class. Yeah. She had status as a patron, certainly, and then there's the whole deacon thing too. I would call, as far as we know, I would call Phoebe as somebody who would be in that middle bracket. She's certainly not among the elite as far as we know, but she'd be in that middle bracket of people who are successful. She could be a freedwoman. Her name is Greek, and we don't know what her full name was, only that. Yeah, I wouldn't call her, class is just such a sticky thing. I wouldn't call her a member of the elite, but certainly of somebody who does well. Okay. And then it seems that the Roman Catholic lectionary practices social invisibility by erasing Phoebe. Oh yeah, we'll get to that too. The number of women who do not appear in the lectionary is just astounding, and I don't think it's because anybody had a plot to eliminate them. They just weren't considered important, you know. So
well, on that hopeless note, I think we're going to end it tonight, and hopefully we've raised our visibility and become more important in the church today. Carolyn, thank you. This was a great introduction to the course. We're all looking forward to next week and the 5 other classes to follow. So I thank everybody for coming tonight. Have a wonderful evening and see you all next week for Spirit Alive Part 2 of this course. Thank you, Carolyn. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.